So without further ado, I want to introduce our introducer, who we're very happy to have with us, who is our provost, Dr. Anand Mari. And he has a particular relationship with our speaker today, and was probably somewhat instrumental in helping us get him here. And so without further ado, Anand, please introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dave. So, as I said, as Dave said, my name is Anand, and 2 weeks into my permanent position, I get to introduce my brother-in-law. So, Nathaniel Cormier serves as managing studio director for landscape architecture for RIOS, R-I-O-S, out in California, and he got started in his career back in 1995 when we were seniors at Bowdoin, and he created a honors project, which was a Japanese garden called Kare Sansui style Japanese garden. He built in 1995 for his project for a cost of $1,500, and it's still there 30 years later. So that's where his career started. And he would stay at the garden to make sure his fraternity brothers, which I was one of them, which is right next to the garden, right next to our house at 38 College Street in Brunswick, Maine, that we were not going to go mess up his garden, which we threatened to do many times over, which he did not do. And then he went off to get his master's degree at Harvard, and his work is, you can find his work in Houston, Denver, Palm Springs, and other places, and he focuses on unearthing local spaces as catalysts for revitalizing urban common spaces. So he focused on public parks and cultural spaces. So I give you Nathaniel Cormier.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Nice job memorizing all that. Let me give you a little bit more background. So I grew up in and around Boston, Massachusetts, and then Madison, Wisconsin. My folks live now in Duluth, and my mom also came down since I was here in the neighborhood. Anand met my sister when they were both grad students in Madison, and they have 3 beautiful daughters growing up here in Muncie now. Some of them are here, I think, as well. So it's a family affair. Anand and I had wonderful adventures at Bowdoin College, around New England. We both studied abroad in Japan, so that was another interesting connection. And as Anand described, after Bowdoin, I went on to Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and in 1999, I began practicing landscape architecture in Seattle. I'm now the managing studio director for landscape architecture at RIOS in Los Angeles, and I'll show you sort of the along the way how I got from one place to the next. Back in those days in Seattle, I was also teaching and lecturing quite a bit, and in 2009, I had the honor of giving an Emmons professorship lecture here at Ball State, and we spent a week charetting the White River through Muncie. I went for a run yesterday to see if any of the student work had been implemented. There's still plenty of opportunities for this generation. I'll leave it at that. And in 2015, my family and I relocated to Los Angeles, and I'm really excited to be back here again 14 years later to share some mid-career reflections. I should unpack this title a little bit. I got really carried away with all the alliteration, so I'll just break it down a bit. Hyperlocal Histories is about uncovering and amplifying the unique stories that make a place meaningful. Co-creating places recognizes the collaborative role that communities and stakeholders play in this process of daylighting the authentic possibilities of each place. And cultivating curiosity is really my mission as a design professional. I want to be around people that care about their communities, and this is a way that I can contribute to their pride of place. Unfortunately, attuning oneself to the intrinsic qualities of a place is increasingly an act of resistance. Michael Jacob, seen here, he's a Swiss professor of landscape theory and history, and he gave a lecture entitled Landscape Architecture and the New Generic. He called out a creeping sameness around the world in the built work of landscape architecture. Possible culprits that he identified include social media, developer financing, building codes, software standardization, and so on. And this was 2018, so he didn't mention artificial intelligence, but I would certainly add that to the list as well. And so the question for us is, how can we inspire a renewed concern for a place's genius loci in the face of these homogenizing forces? This is precisely the power of curiosity. As the philosopher Michel Foucault put it, curiosity evokes care of what exists and what might exist, and a willingness to look at the same things in a different way, to see new possibilities in the everyday or the overlooked. If indifference describes a state of not caring, we want the opposite, right? We want careful attention to difference. Let's look more closely at how curiosity works. The psychologist Daniel Berline described in the 1950s a range from perceptual curiosity, triggered by novelty, surprise, and the unexpected. Imagine if I told you there's a box under your seat. It's not Oprah, there's no box. But you know how that would feel. You'd want to know what's in that box. All the way up to epistemic curiosity, that deep hunger in humans towards discovery and understanding. That's why you chose this course of study. That's why you chose to teach or to research, is this deep knowledge hunger. Berline had a student, H.I. Day, who extended this work into education policy in the 1980s. He described an ideal state where one is aware that there's more out there that they don't know. He called it this zone of curiosity. And at an optimal level, it's characterized by exploration and excitement and interest. That's how you want to be as a citizen, as a student, and certainly as somebody who's enjoying the landscape. If you're below this optimal level, and it's fun to give this talk to students, he describes a know-nothing individual who is unmotivated and disinterested all the way to the point of coma, potentially. And then beyond the optimal level, the know-it-all individual is unmotivated and likewise disinterested. So if we can create environments for learning, for inhabitation, that are rich in complexity and known unknowns, as Day suggests, we can inspire a spirit of enthusiastic and productive exploration. What could this zone of curiosity mean in the landscape? What experiential qualities would we emphasize? We can look to our landscape and art history for another period when designers turned against the creeping sameness of their day. Uwe Price wrote in 1794, "The picturesque in landscape might be in part defined as that disposition of objects which, by a partial and uncertain concealment, excites and nourishes curiosity." Price, Richard Payne Knight, William Gilpin, and other peak picturesque thinkers relied initially on lessons from 3 centuries of painters and from travel sketching to offer an alternative to the popular but boring mainstream of the late 18th century. This was the before view of that last immersive picturesque scene. Uwe Price's critique was squarely in the direction of Capability Brown and his many followers, describing disgust at the clumps, belts, and made water, the eternal smoothness and sameness of a finished place. Finished implies static, while the picturesque celebrates the alive, even the decaying, always the changing landscape. The picturesque, hopefully some of you guys have history classes still around here, arose as a third way contrasted with Edmund Burke's opposed beautiful and sublime. If the beautiful inspires calm, as in this Capability Brown scene here, and the sublime leads to terror, as in this Alps painting by Turner, the picturesque is really defined by curiosity, stimulated through intricacy, variety, and roughness. I'll return to these qualities in a bit, but first I want to take you on a quick tracing of history of the picturesque, from the Italian pittoresco paintings through various artists to landscape designers and theorists of the late 18th century England, all the way to the landscapes that we most enjoy today. The word picturesque comes from the Italian pittoresco, which described an innovation in the brushwork of some 16th century Venetian painters. It emphasized visible and emotive brushstrokes rather than the smooth strokes of their predecessors. The term came to apply to artwork that was painterly and unrestrained in this way. One of those unrestrained artists most frequently referenced by picturesque writers was Claude Lorrain, a 17th century French painter who spent most of his life in Italy. His drawings and paintings were collected especially by English patrons on the grand tour of Europe and were celebrated for their use of light, the elevation of pastoral or natural landscape over the classical architecture and religious figures that had been a greater focus of previous generations. Buildings were often partially hidden or in a state of ruin, and Price especially appreciated the savage, broken, abrupt qualities of Claude's forms. No curves that answer each other was another direct critique of Capability Brown's work. At the same time, in Northern Europe, Dutch Golden Age painters like Jacob Ruysdael went even further in discarding classical architecture and religious symbolism to portray scenes of everyday life in the countryside and cities. In this work, the landscape media took greater prominence through detailed studies of foliage and branching, soils and geology, weather and weathering. He painted this dune landscape at only 17 years old, younger than, well, except for my beautiful smart nieces, younger than anybody else in this room, and I have to imagine that his relative lack of formal indoctrination in traditional subjects and techniques allowed his own curiosity about the world around him to shine through in the work. 100 years later, leading English artists such as Thomas Gainsborough, Turner, and Constable were deeply influenced by Ruysdael, copying his work. Let me do a quick flip back and forth. Copying his work and applying his approach of observing directly from nature rather than relying on formal academic or classical rules. Gainsborough was a friend of Uvidal Price's father and visited their Foxley estate to sketch and spend time with the family. No doubt this helped accelerate Price's appreciation of picturesque characteristics in the landscape. Note this is 1746, and these are examples of what was happening in built landscape at the same time. Those 18th century artists were pulling meaning out of the landscape itself, direct contact with the land, while most landscape designers were only partway there. They had moved on from the symmetries and formal parterres of the Baroque era, but they still relied heavily on classical references in various temples, statues, and follies. Capability Brown followed them, dropping some of these classical structures, but leaned in even harder to an idealized English landscape of manicured lawns, clumps, and that made water. Another important precursor to the picturesque in landscape design was domestic travel sketches and essays, initially by William Gilpin, but soon copied by many elites who in previous generations might have made that grand tour of mainland Europe. During the summer months in the 1760s and 1770s, Gilpin traveled around the countryside, making watercolors and keeping journals on his theories about picturesque landscapes. Gilpin first defined the picturesque as expressing that particular kind of beauty which is agreeable in a picture. He was referencing specifically those paintings that we just looked at. His journals were full of insights about what subjects and qualities are proper subjects for painting: roughness, intricacy, variety. This idea that the picturesque was something to be discovered or captured is especially evident in the popularity at that time of the Claude glass. Named for Claude Lorrain again, this convex dark mirror was something that these tourists would carry around with them to render scenery more painterly. Gilpin promoted their use and released his own sketchbooks as a series of ovals as a nod to this primitive viewfinder. It's worthwhile to note that Price and Knight inherited their estates, in Price's case at Foxley, where he was continuing the development of a landscape that his grandfather and father had initiated. He didn't have to get clients like Capability Brown did, and he could dedicate himself wholly to this singular landscape and to his writing. It's also important to recognize that this aesthetic movement was primarily a preoccupation of wealthy landowners at a time when they were also privatizing lands that were formerly held in common through the enclosure movement. Some have referred to a process of justifying or naturalizing power underpinning these picturesque ideals. So we should be aware of these broader social, economic, and political contexts, but also able to draw lessons from the movement, especially as we witness its influence moving out of the purely private realm into the earliest roots of our public park systems. J.C. Loudon would bring this sensibility to the public for the first time at Derby Arboretum in 1840, stating, "I am the first to follow Mr. Price's principles." And Joseph Paxton would continue this progression with the first publicly funded garden at Birkenhead Park in 1843. Andrew Jackson Downing would travel from the US to England and Europe in 1850 and bring the picturesque back with him, as well as a relationship with Calvert Vaux, who he would invite to New York City to help envision a central park for the city. The picturesque is an idea of beauty strongly and irregularly expressed, said Downing. With Downing's untimely demise in a steamboat accident, Frederick Law Olmsted, who had coincidentally also visited the picturesque gardens of England in 1850, carried on this vision for Central Park with Vaux by his side. The work of Price and Gilpin was so influential to Olmsted that he gave copies of their books to all his staff and students and admonished them to read these seriously as a student of law would read Blackstone. The picturesque has continued to spark interest up to the present. Robert Smithson, the influential land artist most famous for Spiral Jetty, celebrated the intricacy of Olmsted's design in his 1973 Art Forum piece. Speaking of the ramble in Central Park, he wrote, "This place out-labyrinthed labyrinths." More broadly, he acknowledged the picturesque through line from Price and Gilpin through Olmsted to his contemporary view of landscape as not static or formalistic, but instead the expression of a manifold of relationships. Susan Harrington of the University of British Columbia, writing in the mid-aughts, continued this recovery of the picturesque, explaining that while post-industrial landscapes such as Gasworks Park in Seattle and the emerging work of landscape urbanists, she wrote, they don't necessarily look like the picturesque in the way that Olmsted's did, but they partake in similar aesthetic processes and viewer sentiments by engaging people's imaginations, emotions, and memories. All right, I promise it's the end of the history lesson. But what can we distill from such a survey of art and design about the landscape characteristics that can put us into that zone of curiosity? At the largest scale of overall composition, we can develop intricate landscapes full of complexity that invite exploration so that layers are revealed as one moves through them. At the medium scale of form, we should seek variety through novelty that allows for those surprises, those discoveries, and offers contrasting cultural frames that situate us in the rewilded complexity. And at the finest scale of materiality, we should embrace roughness through rich textures and handmade elements that reveal the terroir of a place. I've tried to pursue these types of qualities in project work over the years, and I'll share some examples in a moment. But first, I'd like to take a shot at describing the creative process as I've come to understand it. What I've experienced and tried to instill in teams is a cyclical process of research, experimentation, and craft. Research is about immersion in a place. We should start out like landscape detectives. We're trying to discover clues to what makes a place unique. Rich Haig famously told clients he would only design for their site if he had spent the night on it. It was a playful way of emphasizing the importance of specific and multisensory knowledge of a place and its inhabitants. Other tools I've found to be valuable are thick mapping, to see how seemingly invisible histories leave lasting legacies in the landscape, and taking inventories, whether they be of bird songs or bottle caps. This involves collecting and comparing evidence from the site and its surroundings. Sharing these findings discovered in this stage with community stakeholders inevitably invites lots of additional insights and clues from these local experts. Experimentation leverages the rich source material gathered in the research stage to generate an abundance of imaginative, creative outputs, from the abstract, whether it's poetry or artwork, to more specific tools for community outreach, like illustrative sketches and models. Of course, in bringing these artifacts of the design process back to the community, we're seeking input on the right program, what their priorities are, but we're also trying to provoke emotional responses. These responses allow us as designers to attune our instincts towards design ideas with the greatest potential resonance. It can sometimes feel like a collective therapy session, and we're using these prompts like a spatial Rorschach test to see what works, to see what really lands with these audiences that will inhabit the place. And finally, craft is about making decisions. The word decide comes from the Latin desire, to cut away. So craft involves editing away most of the ideas explored in the experimentation stage to reveal and refine the most impactful design direction in an iterative conversation with stakeholders. At the overall site scale, this might involve marking out the pathways and spaces in situ to experience and refine the layout. Often we're getting our hands on real material samples so we can compose them into harmonious palettes of hardscape and planting. And whether it's high-tech or low-tech, this is where all the various 3D modeling, visualization tools that you're learning, fabricating and assemblies and mock-ups, this helps in this process of steadily funneling down toward the best solutions. And of course, I call it a cycle because you might do this at the grand scale of the partie or the overall concept, but then it's going to repeat itself as you move into design development, as you move into those construction details. Each design place should reflect the unique qualities of its surroundings and the serendipity of a sincere collaborative process. That's among design team members, and it's also in partnership with community stakeholders. I'm going to share with you some highlights. The first row is from my 16 years in Seattle, and the second row is from these last 8 years in Los Angeles, all of this work with RIOS. And in addition to hopefully giving examples of some of those landscape characteristics and processes that I described, I hope it's useful for you as students to see the arc of a career. Some of that early work, I was the guy who had to do the CAD and go out to the construction visits and all of that. And further along in mid-career, now I'm often in a role as a team leader. It's really more my responsibility to mentor, to make space, to empower those team members so that they can make their mark. These first 3 projects are from my first job at Jones & Jones Architects and Landscape Architects in Seattle. And this one, Oxbow Park, is in Seattle's Georgetown neighborhood. Little Marco Rubio moment there. The site seemed to be vacant, save for a few small trees and a desire line to a nearby convenience store. But thick mapping the vicinity revealed that this site was once a coal and wood storage yard which received the flat-bottom boats of supplies for the growing Georgetown on this oxbow of the Duwamish River before it had been straightened. You can see how the street grid is kinked off of the normal north-south to fit between 2 bends in the river. That made us curious. Another important starting point for this project was a former 1950s gas station, the Hat and Boots, which was slated for demolition a few blocks away on the old Highway 99. While beloved by skateboarders who had made this 40-foot cowboy hat a cult favorite, they were falling apart, and an adjacent community college was expanding onto the site. We researched the Googie movement of roadside attractions and its association with the streamlined forms, a popular interpretation of modernism. We also studied ways that we might pick up these fragile elements and bring them to the park site. We experimented with a variety of programs and spatial relationships, and an idea emerged of using a series of low concrete bones, like the former storage yard crib walls, in order to hold together the diverse amenities of the park while hinting at the meandering river and this twisting of Georgetown off of the north-south grid. We brought clay models to the community, illustrating ways to cut into the ground for rain gardens and then use that soil to form garden terraces and an amphitheater landform. We mocked up the design on site so the public could experience it at full scale, and we figured out how to peel off the hat's shotcrete so it could be safely cribbed and carried into the park. We also rummaged around the neighborhood's antique shops and scrapyards for hints of Georgetown's rich history, with saws and horseshoes, wrenches and gears making their way into that skeleton of concrete bones to be discovered throughout the park. The contractor did the heavy lifting, but volunteer work parties then took care of the native plantings and community garden installation. The park opened to robust programming with the hat still only partially put back together. Laura Haddad, a wonderful public artist and friend, dressed the hat in flowers to raise money for its restoration. This was before drone photography, so I had to go up in a big, scary cherry picker to get that shot there. You can see some of my earliest attempts at what Uwe Dahl Price would call that partial concealment at work. Not knowing what I know now about Price, I was, at that time, thinking, I want people to wonder, is this a ruin? Is there more under the surface? And the hat was eventually restored, and the hat and boots have reclaimed their cult status. But it's also a place for everyday neighborhood joys, like play. This is my oldest. He's now just about to get his driver's license. And Mom, I gave you a cameo here, too. Or just a place for gardening or simply relaxing. So that's Oxbow Park. Mount Baker Ridge Viewpoint is in Seattle's Mount Baker neighborhood. It's a narrow hilltop site with a remarkable view back to downtown and the Olympic Mountains to the west. Community meetings in a nearby church basement revealed that neighbors especially enjoyed sunsets here. And as we researched that idea, bringing back various analyses and mappings of celestial movements, someone said, can we have Stonehenge? And we thought, well, that's a brilliant idea, but on this very precarious slope, it's going to need a little bit of reinterpretation. So on-site mock-ups allowed us to experiment with various applications of this Stonehenge prompt, and we eventually settled on a sunset dial as our draft concept, again, inviting residents to come and see what that might mean at full scale on the ground. We recruited a University of Washington astronomer, Woody Sullivan, to our cause. He helped us understand that sunset times that we used to read in the paper and now you can find them online, they are idealized as if you were on a completely smooth Earth. Anything that pops up on your horizon, if it's a distant mountain or a mid-ground tower or a foreground tree, that interrupts the sun on its way down, and you get an earlier and slightly leftward shifted sunset depending on those conditions. So Woody used this ancient device here to map out our precise horizon and then provided us with the critical angles we'd need to use if we were going to build our viewpoint around the setting sun. We arranged the steel beams of this cantilevered deck and slices through the guardrail and through these seating stones to align perfectly with our sunset at each solstice. So there's June, and so at each solstice, and then the equinoxes in the middle, and every month in between as the sun works its way back and forth, you get the, once a month landing the sun right down through the slice. So we had a lot on the line before we'd know for sure that Woody's calculations were accurate. They were already building all the steel, was not going to get a chance to move anything. And fortunately, they were spot on. And so once each month, the park comes alive with curious Wiccans and phenomenologists. It's really become a destination beyond the neighborhood. And of course, it's also a cherished ridgetop public space for community celebrations and for the daily rhythms of this Seattle neighborhood. All right, last one from Jones & Jones. This is the Mercer Slough Environmental Education Center. It's located in Bellevue, Washington. We started with research into the changing water levels of Lake Washington and this thumb off of the lake called Mercer Slough. We looked at the hillside views, and we carefully studied each existing tree on the steeply sloping site. We pitched to the client, what if we could break up your program? It had been previously planned for another site with one big, large building. We said, what if it was a collection of these wedge-shaped sheds, and we nestle them among the existing trees. A central plaza came to be inspired by the region's logging history as if it was a log-jammed creek. Its form was a kind of unfolding from the smooth, fast geometries of the auto-dominated drop-off to the areas that are slow and more discovery-oriented, the zigging and zagging of boardwalks among the trees and elevated buildings. The classrooms and wet labs were distributed in these perched sheds with views out to the slough. Decks, windows, and even a little treehouse take you to intimate and up-close canopy encounters. They also provide outdoor education spaces, or what we came to call kid corrals that the educators had asked for to help contain the student groups. And in support of this educational mission, we treated the building roofs like watersheds, collecting the runoff into this railside runnel to let visitors experience the falling rain before it makes its way to splash block gabions below. These next two projects, built and natural worlds are knit together into an ensemble as both venue for environmental education and as an example of a more sensitive coexistence. Just jumping ahead here. These next two projects are from my time with SVR, a multidisciplinary firm of landscape architects and civil engineers, also in Seattle. Bell Street Park is in Seattle's Belltown neighborhood. The big idea was basically to hybridize a public street right-of-way and park-like qualities. And we first had to ask ourselves, why go to all that brain damage? Most cities don't have enough parkland. And at the same time, streets can often be 40% or more of a given city. And most cities' parkland has been opportunistically acquired and is poorly connected. So if we're using streets, we can also help connect those existing assets. So streets with park-like qualities can add a lot of value to our open space networks. This project was the first 4 blocks of an envisioned greenway that would eventually connect the revitalized waterfront being worked on by field operations and the rapidly transforming South Lake Union neighborhood, home to Amazon's headquarters. Our research daylighted Bell Street Park at Bell Street as one of the places where early city shapers, they sluiced away the former hills of downtown Seattle into Elliott Bay down Bell Street. Contemporary Seattle was, of course, well known as an emerging tech hub. And by some alchemy of these images and these inspirations, we began to experiment with the notion of a meandering circuitry for this linear park. That circuitry became a way to flexibly accommodate subsurface utilities that would pop up throughout the right-of-way, while slowing vehicles that had to get pushed back and forth as they moved down through the street park, and giving large pulses for more generous space for people and green in the right-of-way. Much of the right-of-way was given to pedestrian-only zones and gardens, and all of the roadway was then raised up into a curbless shared street condition. Cars turning off of the avenue now rise up to the sidewalk elevation via a driveway entrance rather than a radiused curb, signaling to drivers that they're entering a pedestrian-dominated zone and they need to slow down. This change required users to understand how to safely share the right-of-way with new physical cues, both visual and tactile. We carved the former granite curbs into durable seating. You can see a second son join the family here. And pedestrians and drivers have become accustomed to Bell Street as a slow street where diagonal jaywalking is to be expected, with bicyclists also sharing the street park. And on Sundays, the street closes to host cultural events in art-filled Belltown. All right, last in the Seattle series is Hinghe Park in the Chinatown International District. There was an existing park, and Seattle Parks and Rec wanted to expand it onto the site of a decommissioned post office next door. The existing park had what you might expect in traditional Chinese architectural elements. And fortuitously, I had been working on a series of international competitions with Tourandscape out of Beijing since befriending Kong Jianyu in 2009 at an IFLA conference. And so this was an exciting opportunity to invite Kong Jian to come to Seattle and co-create a place that would resonate as authentic with Chinatown stakeholders, but also appeal to a broader cross-section of the community. The brief called for accommodating cultural events, night markets, and large gatherings, and our research traced the complex history woven of many cultures, and stakeholders from these perspectives all wanted representation in the future park, from indigenous Duwamish people to Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Vietnamese, and other immigrant populations. Another important consideration was a significant grade change exceeding 20 feet in some places across the two parcels. And so our research clarified these fundamental site and cultural challenges. We've got to overcome that grade change, and we need to satisfy multiple cultural points of view in the park. We experimented with many formal expressions and landed on the idea of terraces and a theater as a way to address the slope and make the space a flexible stage for many cultures to express themselves rather than a museum of specific physical icons for all the various parties. On the left is an early sketch by Kong Jian. On the right, we evolved the terraces toward an even more meandering accessibility route in order to link the upper and lower park areas. We also developed a dramatic gateway element as an invitation to enter the park that also acted as a proscenium for the event space stage. A series of amphitheater seating elements allowed shortcuts up through those ramping terraces. And these were crafted to satisfy, of course, the circulation and seating, but also as dramatic lanterns in the park. Each was also an opportunity to incorporate a motif from Asian art. This one has the Monkey King stealing the peach. These colorful elements help to animate daily life and create a festive backdrop for events where everyone is welcome to share their cultural expressions. So these next 5 projects are more recent work at RIOS. I hope some of you had a chance to visit the gallery. We've got more about the practice and a broader range of work out there. Palm Springs Downtown Park was actually my first assignment when I started working with Mark Rios in 2017. He asked me, so what do you know about the desert? So got to work, and our research started with a deep dive into the region's dynamic geology, where tectonic plates, the Pacific headed south and the North American plate headed north, grind past each other. We get all sorts of interesting phenomena, from earthquakes to hot springs. The earliest inhabitants of the Coachella Valley are known as the Cahuilla Indians. Cahuilla people have lived in this area for over 5,000 years and interacted with tribes as far away as contemporary Los Angeles, Arizona, and Mexico. Their oral tradition tells of a powerful leader who created the original hot spring of Palm Springs as a perpetually enduring place to heal. They called the spring Sekhe, boiling water, which Spanish explorers later translated to Agua Caliente, giving the local Cahuilla band its name. In the winter, the Agua Caliente stayed down on the warmer valley floor, close to those hot springs. And in the summers, they migrated up to the cool water and air of nearby palm-filled canyons. In 1887, the first hotel in Palm Springs was constructed next to an Agua Caliente hot spring. Nellie Kaufman, known as the mother of Palm Springs, is credited with transforming this tiny desert village into the world-famous tourist destination we now know. Arriving in 1909, she opened a small sanatorium for visitors to find healing respite from respiratory diseases. In time, she transformed the Desert Inn, the park site is on the former Desert Inn, into a luxury resort and became the region's foremost evangelist for what she called the 4 S's of the desert: space, stillness, solitude, and simplicity. The region also attracted less conventional visitors. Perhaps most intriguing was Bill Pester. He's a German immigrant who came to California in 1916 to study himself with untrammeled nature as his classroom. He lived alone in a thatch hut in Taquitz Canyon. His proto-hippie wanderings inspired many others, like Jim Morrison here, to forsake the developed world for a day or a lifetime of immersion in the desert's wonders. The reputation for hospitality stuck, and Palm Springs grew into an international hotspot for Hollywood stars, glamour, and the Rat Pack. This coincided with the emergence of Palm Springs as a mecca for mid-century modern architecture and design, from civic and commercial buildings to more domestic settings. The region continues to be a special destination for a diverse community of visitors, residents, and snowbirds who nearly double the population each winter. Many come for world-class cultural events such as Modernism Week and Coachella. Especially in the city of Palm Springs, a spirit of tolerance prevails, and this has cultivated a reputation as an especially inviting place for the LGBTQ community. Our team spent research field trips hiking in the surrounding landscapes to understand how the native palm ecosystem might help address extreme heat. The team translated field measurements. We measured the distance between palms and mapped them onto our site to understand how the tight spacing and irregular trunk forms might make their way into the park's native palm grove. We also visited surrounding mountains and witnessed colorful banded rock formations which would inform a custom sedimentary finish for vertical walls and modular seat blocks. Taquitz Falls, Jim was swimming in over there, inspired a powerful cascade for the heart of the park that brings the magic of the surrounding mountains to the urban core. Our research also included, of course, community workshops to understand programmatic and experiential desires of residents. We eventually distilled our findings into a series of options, really those experimental prompts that amplified diverse facets of this place to discover which would resonate most powerfully. Aspects of the oasis and gathering options made their way into a draft concept which we brought back in renderings and physical models to engage stakeholders in the process of crafting the final direction. This direction amplified the qualities that underpinned the timeless appeal of this destination in the Colorado desert. At that larger compositional scale, you can see how even before this palm grove canopy is fully continuous, the grove forms a complex veil for the park and stimulates curiosity for people who are entering the park from the new retail mixed-use district beyond. Once you move into the park, you start to discover a variety of forms and colors. We included movable furnishing so folks could follow the shade, and asked the nearby palm nursery for some of their oddball specimens to bring some of the irregularity of the native palm grove to the park. Some palms kept their skirts, and others were limbed up for lighting. By day, people tend to follow that shade, especially in the summer, and at night, when the desert cools down, the park glows and invites evening activation. The planting design was an opportunity to showcase the sculptural vegetation of the desert with distinct palettes under the palm grove and on the more exposed outcrop. Native flowers such as the bulbine and hesperaloe here informed the colors for armrests and environmental graphics. As each bloom comes on, you get moments of serendipitous alignment, adding a temporal dimension to the stimulation of curiosity and delight. The outcrop along the park's northern edge forms a second space in the park and shields an adjacent parking garage, rising from amphitheater seating at the stage area to form our waterfall and eventually a restroom building and police substation. The outcrop showcases more of the drought-tolerant native species such as ocotillo and palo verde, and features innovative translations of that local geology we discovered on our hikes into the hardscape at a material scale. Locally quarried Palm Springs gold stone was used in the paving, the DG paths, and the rock mulch, and this is that sedimentary finish inspired by the local mountains. We used it in the modular blocks and then adapted it to a shotcrete application for the vertical walls. This is our little Taquitz Falls with our hot spring-inspired jets. And misters cool the park and create this dynamic, ever-changing atmosphere. The third room of the park is the theater, with a palm frond-inspired shade canopy over the stage. They host lots of live performances and film nights and festivals in the outdoor theater. My favorite so far was this ABBA cover band. All right. All right, another RIOS project, South Park Commons in downtown Los Angeles. Our client, a private developer, Mac Real Estate, was building a large residential tower to the south of this space and agreed as a community benefit to provide a paseo that would offer mid-block pedestrian connection for the neighborhood. An existing condo building framed the other side of the space, and we tested out a variety of ways that this space might do more than just allow that pedestrian connection. We said, is it a theater? Is it a backyard? Is it a plaza? Again, our research included lots of those community sessions to share our findings and listen to the hopes and dreams of South Park. And what emerged from that process was a sense that residents who choose hyper-urban living, they're making a fundamental trade-off. We might get those amazing pool decks and some other amenities along with our small apartments, but we're never going to have that sense of having a backyard that many of us associate with the American dream. And so we discovered that by simply crinkling the required paseo, we could give South Park residents a feeling of being in a backyard in these garden alcoves. In crafting the precise geometry and balancing how much space to give to the pass-through paseo versus those backyard alcoves on either side, we mocked it up at full scale in a nearby park and even simulated the adjacent restaurant terrace so folks could imagine outdoor dining overlooking this space. You can see here in this early days drone shot how we signaled the pass-through paseo with a more common concrete and used a top cast of warmer crushed stone to suggest a more natural and slow-paced hangout on either side. Since this shot, the restaurant is finished and filled that up with outdoor dining, and an art piece has landed in this alcove on the right. It's a privately stewarded public space. Our client can control access. Basically what they do is they close the gates at 10 p.m., but we still wanted a feeling of transparency and a civic invitation into the space. We have a significant challenge with encampments of the unhoused in our western cities. So, we would prefer not to need fences, but in this case it did prevent some of the most challenging behavior, and it allowed us to specify furniture that really encourages lounging rather than some of the less hospitable cues that too many spaces give off. The art piece by Desire, Obtain, Cherish, that's what he goes by, is called Lucky Break. It's a giant wishbone, and it's a nod to so many who come to LA hoping to break into the entertainment industry. And here you can see my boys are a little bit bigger there. By day or evening, it's become a place for quiet respite, for socializing, and of course, building community. One hotel selected an existing pair of towers on the Sunset Strip in West Hollywood as the site of their Los Angeles outpost. Here we were asked to retrofit this austere plaza that was associated with the prior hotel in these two towers. And we wanted it to feel as if the nearby Hollywood Hills the landscape of the Hollywood Hills had spilled down through the hotel. In place of a straight shot out to dramatic views to the LA basin at the top of the page, we wove a small trail and dense vegetation into a canyon and an oasis as the main entry. As good as those city views are, at this compositional scale, again, we wanted this layers of vegetation to immerse the visitor as they arrived at the hotel. Intricacy contributes to curiosity about the hotel and what are the destinations in and beyond the green. At a formal scale, we used these irregular planters to frame that short hike in the canyon. And at the material scale, we wanted to showcase reclaimed timber from our friends at Angel City Lumber, as well as the rich textures of our local sage chaparral landscape. Hundreds of handmade clay pots by Atelier Vercant allowed us to bring this robust palette into every nook and cranny of the hotel. We sprinkled touches of this immersive green, pots, and reclaimed wood throughout the common spaces. We carefully composed vignetted scenes as a series of poems about Los Angeles for hotel guests. The Philbrook Museum of Art is a remarkable institution in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We're working under Narrate, a local architect, on a series of projects there. The museum is housed in an Italianate villa built in the 1920s by an oil magnate with traditional gardens by Hare and Hare. And what made this opportunity so enticing for us, besides the 25 acres of gardens, was a new leadership team led by Scott Stulen. Scott and his team had been shaking up institutions around the Midwest for years. He was actually at IMA Newfields in Indianapolis immediately before Philbrook. They emphasized relevance to a much broader population than just art purists. They used humor and irreverence and leveraged their gardens to break down the perceived barriers to what had been a stodgy institution. Just before we arrived, they even sold an heirloom Chinese pot from one of their collections and used the proceeds to acquire a huge Kahinde Wiley, signaling to all of Tulsa that everyone is welcome at Philbrook. My favorite of their recent installations in the gardens is a rustic cabin chinked with colorful resin and recycled glass collected from the local community. Of course, we began our research with the usual team site visits, but also further afield. We drove 4 hours out of town to stand among the bison in the largest remaining tallgrass prairie in the world. We dove into big topics like Tulsa's complicated history, the Trail of Tears, a race massacre, the rise of the oil industry, alongside more prosaic topics like irrigation requirements. We distilled our research to frame Philbrook's position in time and in space, its role in the constellation of regional visitor experiences, and as a neighbor in the Garden District. It's just a few blocks away from the gathering place, if you're familiar with that amazing park project. We studied the hydrology of Crow Creek and the site's incredible collection of mature trees. We brought the client interactive exercises to help understand and clarify their priorities about the kinds of experiences that could enliven their gardens. We experimented with various scenarios and eventually settled on a landscape framework plan to guide future improvements. Some of the projects will be more systemic and extensive, such as woodland screening of the edges and creek buffers to keep people safe alongside the creek. Others are signature donor opportunities like a cafe greenhouse and an educational pavilion. This pavilion and its surrounding hillside is actually the first major improvement being implemented from the framework plan, and Chen Gu, Ball State class of 2015, is wrapping up the 50% CD package for this while I'm here. This last project from our work at RIOS is Lynn Wyatt Square for the Performing Arts in downtown Houston's Theater District. We just had the ribbon cutting for this in September after 5 years of work. Formerly known as Jones Plaza and built over a parking structure, it had these largely impermeable edges and a hardscape core intended for large events that rarely materialized. The space is surrounded by the performing arts institutions of Houston, and it's only a couple of blocks away from Buffalo Bayou. Partway through the design competition to win this project, Hurricane Harvey caused massive flooding throughout downtown, including of the parking structure that sat beneath Jones Plaza. So the design of future improvements had to be resilient to future flooding and coordinated with a series of flood barrier measures being installed for the subterranean garages. We wanted to recognize and celebrate the artful gestures and movements of ballet, of theater, of music, and use that spirit, a la Lawrence Halprin and his dancer-choreographer wife Anna, to encourage more activation and more vibrant public life in downtown Houston. Our research involved getting to know the programs and capacities of all those surrounding cultural institutions so that we could reimagine Jones Plaza as a flexible and green square for the performing arts. We anticipated pre-function ballet or theater on the green, free simulcasts during performances so that everyone can get a taste of what's happening in those surrounding buildings. And we also included a multi-level restaurant so you can enjoy dinner before the show or a nightcap afterwards. We designed inviting gardens and a cascading water feature that nods towards the nearby bayou. Here it is almost finished when we were down there for the ribbon cutting. And you can really feel how these artful gestures are pulling in passersby on all the edges and allowing universal access up from all four corners, even though the space is raised up over that parking garage and out of the flood zone. This is our gateway garden and one of those sloping walkways and overlooks at a corner. The water feature has a sloped walkway as well, allowing everyone to wander up through it and touch the water. Amphitheater seating at the back of the green climbs up to the porch of the restaurant that overlooks the performance green. And there's an appropriate sense of theatricality to the square after dark. It's a new heart and a jumping off point to all of Houston's theater district. So, 24 years, kind of quickly hitting some highlights. These are projects I've been fortunate to be a part of, and I hope they do illustrate those characteristics and processes that can generate curiosity and ultimately pride of place for their communities. I'm going to leave you here with one of my favorite works by John Constable, a peak picturesque English painter of the early 1800s. He wrote to a colleague, "I should paint my own places best, as painting is but another word for feeling." Thank you for listening. Questions? Comments?
What originally drove you to look into the picturesque movement of
That's a great question. So, of course, like all of you, it was part of the barrage of things I was supposed to learn when I was in school. And I would say it went into the deep recesses for a while. And it was right about that time when I saw Michael Jacobs' lecture. I watched it on YouTube or something like 5 years ago. And I said, yeah, he's right. I do feel like every time I open the magazines, this part of the world, that part of the world, things feel same. Things feel in some ways boring. And I don't know if it was a conversation with a colleague or something turned me onto it, but I started reading biographies of some of what they were going through, the letters they were writing, the battle. Like these guys were like very, even Knight and Price, they were neighbors in Herefordshire, I don't know if I'm saying that right, and they each had an estate. And even though they both hated Capability Brown, they couldn't get along either, and they were like frenemies, and they were always trying to outdo each other. 1794, it turns out they both had their major publications. So I think for a while I just sort of stewed in what was it like in that period for them, and then after absorbing that for a while, made me reflect back both on, is this a tool that I can find a way to digest and articulate for my teams or students or myself, it's a theory, to use in work going forward. And then most recently, then looking back, I said, why did this resonate so much for me? Are there things about the work I was doing that I can sort of see that there were tendencies that this aligned with? So if that's helpful, it wasn't. I wish it had been as simple as like I knew it in 1999, and then I set out to work that way for 20-something years. It was definitely more of a like circling back to things, and I'm sure I'll think about it differently 14 years from now when I'm back again. But I wish I had more time for books. I've got 12 and 15-year-old boys, so audiobooks are my jam because then I can be doing the dishes or something. I don't get in trouble for like if I tried to just sit down and open a book, that would get complicated at home. So I don't think I qualify fully as a history nerd, but I definitely am passionate about this idea that you know, we have so much science we throw at people, like climate change and native plants and bioswales, and you know, I sat between engineers for 8 years. Like, I get all the technical landscape performance dimensions of what a healthy landscape needs to be, but you go out, you know, I went with my mom to the diner, you know, and we're saying, well, what do they think about landscape here in Muncie? Or, you know, just the real, like what people are really moved by, that kind of evidence alone isn't enough to change behavior. And so as designers, I think we have this kind of parallel responsibility to think about aesthetics and beauty and things that might seem like the soft side of things compared to those hard characteristics, because they can be so influential in, you know, moving the sentiment of a population. And so that's, you know, I'm not like, I don't know all the history. I have selective things I go looking for, but it's driven by like my goal as a human and as a designer to cultivate that curiosity so people will care about the community that they're in.
I'm pretty sure that that plexiglass model for Bell Street Park, the kind of revealing the invisible, revealing things you can't see, might have gotten you your first invitation to come here years ago. It was just kind of intriguing, and the more we looked, the more interested we were in that. Do you have other favorites that you may have, you know, have a sense of accomplishment that kind of does the same?
Well, so like I tried to describe, my role within teams has evolved, and so I would say back then, you know, I was staying up late carving plexi or laser cutting and stuff, and I knew how to do all that. And now we have like an insanely talented fab lab that makes like just jaw-droppingly beautiful models and mock-ups and things. So one of them that I'm especially excited about that you could Google is that an integrated team of architects and landscape architects has been developing a terracotta facade system that they took to like the Council of Tall Buildings, I think it's called, something like that. That's all made out of terracotta, and it actually has like modular units. So in some cases it's acting as a brise soleil or a windscreen, and in other cases it actually can host little habitats. And so it was really, you know, I think the sophistication of the model making and the both from a technical and an aesthetic dimension, folks are doing things that I am incredibly impressed by. But I'm probably not the one up all night figuring out how to do it anymore. So yeah, Google our terracotta facade system. It's really spectacular.
You have so many great, like, inspirational histories coming at you for a site. Is it really like the community that's picking the final line? Like, how are you as the design team kind of pushing forward the best of those options?
It's a great question. It's a bit of it's not scientific. I stress vociferously internally and oftentimes explaining to a client that we're not going to the public and saying, do you want chocolate, strawberry, or vanilla? That's why I described it more as this prompt or a Rorschach test. We're putting things in front of them because we're paying attention to how they react. We're not asking for them to make a final decision. And so we try to sincerely believe that all of those things we're bringing forward would each yield a great outcome. Sometimes we have favorites, but we really try to like clean our brain for a minute, put on this other lens and say, okay, now if Palm Springs Park was all about land art, you know, like how would we amplify that reality, that identity? We take it to like an illogical extreme in some cases intentionally, so that we don't like pre-hybridize and put all our favorite things into one solution as an exercise that usually serendipitously leads to some feedback that you can feel either in the surveys or in the room, that people are already saying, you know, that one, there's something magical about that. That's the one that I can tell I'm gonna like take my family to go visit, you know, it feels like us. So we're not asking for a decision, we're asking for engagement so that we can see, it's another data point about what's working. But it can be a little harrowing when you're like, I totally want to go this way, but I told them we'd do 3 options. I don't want to be insincere and show them like, you know, ones that we don't really want. So it's a balancing act. Whoa. But I'm not so cynical that I think that the community has nothing to offer in that conversation. That's why I put co-creating in the title. I think there is something special about whether it's an idea, like when the person said, can we have Stonehenge, you know, all the way to nuanced things like the city council members when we were doing value engineering of Palm Springs Park, we almost lost that sedimentary finish. And we were we were like, hey, we got to build the park, you know, like we got to lose something. And we brought that up. We said, well, here's like a menu of things you could take away to get the budget back on track. And they said, no, that's so essential to this being like authentically what you told us. So I've always put a lot of trust, again, not for the final decision, but that the collective intuition that emerges through really engaging, that we're going to co-create something outstanding.
So what is your role in terms of design now that you've been elevated into?
It varies from project to project. If it's going really well, I try to stay out of the way. if like, you know, I can tell something's not bubbling up, I might get more involved in the conceptual end of things. I think I'm often most involved in the storytelling, always the interview, what's our big idea, what's the concept, and then it's a curating, cultivating, catalyzing, trying to get as much sense of ownership by the design team as possible. And in some cases, you know, hopefully it's the case that you've, you know, attracted and retained people that are even smarter than us, that a better idea will emerge, you know, from a junior person or a colleague who's, you know, collaborating. So I try not to get too attached to it as my idea or someone else's idea, but really that we're creating a process where everybody is participating and putting things in there. Then it gets down to like, all right, who's got the skills to do the different things to make the development of the design, the construction documentation, and so forth. And that's where I've definitely shifted to, you know, I might be working on 24 different projects at a time, and I'm counting on people who are working on 1 or 2 things to go to that level of depth where, you know, the fellow who is developing that sedimentary finish, like, so passionate, meeting with the precast concrete folks and understanding the nuances of the different grain sizes and all that stuff. That's not going to be my role anymore. But what I want to do is create a platform where that person can fully, you know, take ownership of the design and feel like, you know, when he goes there with his family, he's like, look at my park, you know, like that's the best feeling ever. The last CAD that I used was R14, so that gives you kind of
What's the relationship of the offices across the country and internationally, one to another?
Yeah, good question. I didn't get into all the sort of RIOS structure. So we were founded in the late 80s by Mark RIOS in Los Angeles. And when I started, we were only in Los Angeles. We had, during the pandemic, we learned how to obviously do all the hybrid workplace stuff. We had folks who, for mostly lifestyle reasons, but then there were folks we wanted to work with. We had offices in Portland, Austin, Boulder, and as we figured out how to work that way, we realized, well, we could be more proactive and say, how could we look further afield to other creative capitals and plant our flag in some of those places, and hopefully over time develop a broader range typologically and in terms of just new cultures and stories to immerse ourselves in. And so now those are in London, Singapore, and Shanghai. Sometimes it works really well. You know, you have you finish at your end of the day and you have a nice overlap meeting and someone else works on it for a while and you wake up and it's further along than you started. But sometimes the overlaps are more challenging and you don't get to have that in-person sit down and sketch together that is so critical, especially to mentorship and to having that feeling of co-creating something. So, you know, there's trade-offs, but at this point, we're learning our way through it, and there are enough benefits to that visibility in new places and access to new creative partners that we're really developing that pretty seriously. The majority, let's say there's 270 or so people, maybe 220 or so are in LA still.
You just described the sketching with folks in different offices.
Yeah.
So you nerd out a little bit with us on materials and formats, programs, or sketchbooks, multiple trace. What do you do? What does that design process look like?
I think there's a little bit of a pendulum shift for us underway where, because we were investing in these offices, we were trying to make hybrid as hybrid native as possible, if you will. So we were trying to replicate everything you might do in person with Miro boards, Zoom, then looking at the Miro, or we would all be talking through Zoom, but then sketching together. A few benefits of it that I saw, typically when the paper's in front, there can be a little bit of a hesitancy from a junior designer. The senior person has the Pentel marker, and you're sort of waiting for them to stop before you might tentatively ask something. Whereas when you can see everybody buzzing around like little bees on the Miro board, I think there's just, people feel a little more comfortable just throwing down lots of different things, or you might draw your little thing off to the side and wait for an opening and say, hey, can we take a look at this other alternative over here? I think that that was, for a couple of years, really an important focus for us. And then most recently, when we can, we're really trying to get some paper back up on the walls. We're seeing, particularly in the mentorship, in seeing what a drawing at full size printed out, particularly towards the documentation end of things, is just so critical. That there's people might be solving there's something about being in the computer where you're solving it one way over here and a different way over here, but then when you see it on the wall and you say to yourself, why'd you do that? And it's like, oh, it's like, it just smacks you in the head that, you know, we need to be more consistent, or, you know, just certain insights emerge from that more tangible process. So continues to be a hybrid, but I would say we're trying to add back more of the in-person. We went from 2 days minimum to 3 days minimum in the office. You know, I think as those other offices grow and mature and have their own critical mass, they'll be able to do the same. But of course, there's probably a bias towards the folks that are in the main office at this point. Thanks, everybody.